On the morning of Friday the 23rd of February 1968, a man on his way to work in Glasgow, Scotland, stumbled upon something that would have a lasting effect on the city and the country. Laid out, somewhat tucked away in the doorway of a garage was a woman. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even seem to notice that she wasn't alone anymore. But then again, it appeared that she was not breathing. She was bleeding, or had at least been bleeding profusely from what looked like a severe beating to her face and head, and once the man had braved a closer look at her, he knew that she was deceased. He called the police, who descended on the blood-spattered scene to begin what would turn into a long and incredibly difficult investigation. It was clear that the woman had been attacked. She'd been the victim of a physical assault that had left her face and head battered and severely wounded, but unfortunately that's not all that had happened. The woman had been stripped and all of her possessions presumably stolen, aside from a shoe that was later recovered close to the scene, but her killer had left her something of her own to keep. Tied around her neck was her own stocking, a stocking that was later determined to be how she'd been strangled to death. The investigators immediately dived into a search of the neighbourhood, going door to door to see if anyone had heard or seen anything that had happened right on their street, and it didn't take them long to uncover some chilling facts. A witness recalled hearing a woman scream, leave me alone," in the early hours of the morning, but hadn't thought to inform the police until they were literally on their doorstep. As the investigators continued to interview other potential witnesses on the street, a call was placed to a local hospital for them to come and collect the body so it could be kept and stored safely. But it was then that the first big break in the case came through. A man working in the ambulance that arrived took one look at the body and recognised the victim. She was Patricia Docker, a 25-year-old nurse who was only a few metres away from her own home when she was attacked and brutally murdered. Now with an identity to work with, the police continued to search the area while they waited to inform Patricia's family of the news. Patricia's watch was recovered from a pool of water near the crime scene. Her handbag was later pulled from the nearby River Cart, and the next day, her father went down to formally identify her body. There, her father was able to give the investigators a better picture of where Patricia had been during her final hours before her life had been tragically cut short. Patricia was only 25, but already by then she'd lived a very full and adventurous life. Her father had been an engineer in the Royal Air Force, meaning that from a young age, Patricia had left their hometown of Glasgow and had travelled across the world, all the way to Singapore. After growing up in an entirely different continent, Patricia and her family returned to Glasgow, where Patricia then met Alexander Docker. He was a pilot in the RAF, and when Patricia was only 19, she struck out on another adventure. She married Alexander and moved to Cyprus, where the couple had their son, Sandy. Patricia stayed at home to raise her son, but it was here that the seeds for what she wanted to do with her life were planted. Patricia often watched TV shows that revolved around hospitals, and something clicked. When her marriage with Alexander started getting rocky, Patricia packed up and moved herself and Sandy back home to her parents in Glasgow, where she began her training and became a nurse. On the evening of February the 22nd, Patricia told her parents that she was heading to a local dance hall called Majestic Ballroom. The ballroom held an over-25s night every Thursday, and Patricia wanted to go, meet new people and dance the night away. She seemed excited, and when Patricia didn't come home that night, her parents assumed that the night had gone well and she had gone to a friend's house, but that was far from the truth. Patricia had gone to the Majestic Ballroom, but when she'd left, she hadn't gone home. From there, Patricia went to Barrowland Ballroom, the biggest ballroom in the whole of Glasgow. Ballrooms and dance halls were a common place to be in the 60s, and it was a good spot for people to meet and mingle or just enjoy the evening. But it was clear that Patricia's evening hadn't gone to plan. A post-mortem put Patricia's time of death to be sometime close to when she was seen leaving Barrowland, suggesting that her killer had either been with her when she'd left or had already been waiting on the street where she was later found. It was also confirmed that her cause of death had been asphyxiation, but it could not be determined if she had been sexually assaulted before she had died. The investigators strongly believed, however, that she had been, especially seeing as she'd been found naked, but the truth was there was very little evidence to go off of, and aside from one neighbour claiming to have heard a woman shouting, there were no other witnesses. The investigation dried up almost as soon as the post-mortem results came through, and it looked as if there'd be no more movement on the brutal case that shocked the city. Patricia's case stood still, and the community of Glasgow seemed to move on. 18 months later, most of the people who had only heard of Patricia's case in the news and had never actually met her had all but forgotten the young woman and mother who'd been attacked right on her doorstep. The ballrooms and dance halls were full once more when a now familiar scene played out once again. Jemima MacDonald was 31. She was married with 3 children, but that wasn't going to stop her from enjoying herself once in a while. By then, she and her family had it down to an art. Whenever Jemima went to the Barrowland ballroom, her sister would look after the children, and Jemima could dance away, safe in the knowledge that her children were with someone that she trusted. But the truth was that on the evening of Saturday, August 16th, 1969, Jemima herself was with someone she couldn't trust at all, and she didn't even know it yet. Jemima was a regular at Barrowland. She knew people and people knew her, but no one seemed to know the young man that Jemima was dancing with that night. Jemima was married, but a dance or two never seemed to hurt, and the pair of them seemed to get on well. Jemima's man was well dressed. He had short brown hair with streaks of lighter, almost a reddish colour to it, and he seemed well read as well. When others could catch a hint of what he was saying, he sounded like he quoted the Bible a lot, but Jemima didn't seem to mind. The pair of them danced well into the night, and around midnight Jemima said her goodbyes and headed off home, escorted by her new gentleman friend. She was last seen heading towards her street, but by 12:40 she still hadn't made the short distance back, and her sister Margaret was starting to worry. Thinking, or perhaps hoping, that she was worrying over nothing and Jemima had gone by a friend's instead, Margaret kept her concerns to herself, but she couldn't ignore them when she heard a startling and disturbing rumour spreading throughout the neighbourhood. Margaret overheard children talking amongst themselves, discussing the body that they had allegedly spotted in a derelict building not too far away. Margaret must have felt a pit in her stomach then, but she held on to hope that Jemima would show up soon. Sunday came and went. Jemima still hadn't come home, and Margaret then knew what she had to do. She went to the derelict building right beside her own house, perhaps only hoping to put her fears to rest, but she found one of the worst things imaginable. Lying face down on the floor, beaten and bloody, was Jemima. Her shoes and stockings had been removed and she'd been strangled to death with one of them. Her autopsy confirmed that she had died approximately sometime during Saturday night or early Sunday morning. She was found wearing most of her clothes, but the report confirmed that she'd been sexually assaulted before her murder. Interviews firmly put Jemima in Barrowland the night of her death, and they firmly planted the seed that both Patricia and Jemima's cases were connected. Both women were brunettes, both were married, and both were mothers. Both women had been to Barrowland right before their murders. There were suspicions of sexual assault in Patricia's case and confirmation of it in Jemima's. They'd both been beaten and then strangled with their own stockings, and they'd both had been menstruating at the time of the attack. Whoever had attacked them had placed their sanitary pads or tampons at the scene, usually somewhere around their bodies before leaving them, and now the investigators believed that they had a physical description of the man behind both murders. Several witnesses recalled seeing Jemima with a young man, somewhere in his mid-20s to early 30s, with that reddish-brown hair, and now the police were wondering if he had committed not one murder, but 2. For the first time in Scottish history, the police released a sketch of their suspect and asked the public for help in identifying him. By then they were working off of 2 very different theories, and they needed more information to figure out which track to take the investigation down. The first was they were looking for a local, or at least someone who knew Glasgow well. The investigators believed that it was possible that whoever had killed both Patricia and Jemima had known the area and had been able to use this knowledge when picking his victims. He needed secluded places to attack the women without being disturbed, and had purposefully gone after victims who'd lived in quieter neighbourhoods. But then again, the investigators also believed that it was possible that the exact opposite was true. That was the main driving force behind the second theory in this case. The killer had struck not once, but twice in Barrowland, and no one in the ballroom had actually known who he was. They remembered what he had looked like, but none of the locals knew his name or where he was from. It was possible that the man had either recently moved to Glasgow or travelled there to perform the killings, and the truth was that the police were nowhere near figuring out which one of these theories was true. While they waited for someone in the public to step forward and name the killer, undercover police went into Barrowland, hoping that the killer would play right into their hands, but he somehow slipped through their fingers. Just over 2 months after Jemima had been found in that derelict building, a man out walking his dog on the morning of October 31st spotted something. Lying in the back garden of a building of flats was a woman. Her face was bloodied, she'd been beaten and partially stripped, and she had something tied around her neck. The police descended on the scene, perhaps already knowing what to look for this time. Helen Puttock was a 29-year-old brunette. She'd met her husband, George Puttock, while staying with her brother in Reading, and George was a military man. She married him when they were both 23 years old, and he was stationed in Germany shortly after. It was there that the couple welcomed their son into their lives, but Helen didn't like Germany and found it hard to settle. She made the decision to move back to Glasgow with her son and stay with her mother, but shortly after moving, she sent word to George back in Germany that the marriage was over. George had used his next leave to visit Helen and try to convince her to stay with him, but Helen had fallen out of love with George and she had made up her mind. Whatever had happened to Helen before that night, her attacker had beaten her around the face and head before sexually assaulting her. He'd then taken one of her stockings and strangled her to death, leaving her body in the garden of her own home. But Helen hadn't gone quietly. Grass stains on her body and shoes showed that Helen had put up a long fight. She'd both physically fought her attacker and had tried to run away. Her being found in her own garden probably proof of how close she'd actually come to making it to safety. Probably as punishment for her desperate fight for her own life, her callous attacker had clamped down and bitten her right thigh. Already there, the cases of these three women looked incredibly similar, but the similarities only continued to grow in number as the investigation went on. Helen had also been menstruating at the time of her murder, and her killer had left her pad under her body. She had also been to Barrowland Ballroom that night, and she hadn't left alone. Helen had bought a brand new black dress with gold buttons on the day, and she'd put it on to go to Barrowland with her sister, Jean Langford. There the two sisters had met and danced with two men, both of them named John. Jean's John was very forthcoming with information about his personal life. He'd lived and worked in Castle Milk, but Helen's John kept his life to himself. He still talked and seemed well-spoken when he did, so it didn't strike the two sisters as odd at the time. After dancing together for a little over an hour, the two couples headed home. Jean's John went his own way to catch a bus, and Helen's John shared a taxi with the two sisters. It was there that Jean managed to get a good look at him. He was a slim man, somewhere in his mid-20s to early 30s, with dark, somewhat reddish hair. His two front teeth overlapped a little, but not to the extent that they made him look at all unattractive. What had put Jean off was the fact that he couldn't seem to stop quoting the Bible. Somehow he managed to turn every conversation back to religion, and he even managed to get in that he thought any married woman who went out dancing was actually cheating on her husband. He even went as far to call Barrowland an quote-unquote adulterous den of iniquity. Needless to say, Helen's John was not a hit with Jean, but the night was nearly over and they would all be home soon. In fact, Jean was the first one who departed from the taxi. It dropped her off outside her house before heading off in the direction of Helen's, with Helen and John still inside. From there, the investigators believed that Helen and John got out of the taxi outside Helen's home, and then John had attacked her. A bus driver later remembered seeing a man in a suit with grass stains and a ripped sleeve at a nearby bus stop in the early hours of the morning. This man was last seen walking towards a ferry to cross the River Clyde, and the investigators believed that he was the man they were looking for. They'd found a man's cufflink at the scene of Helen's attack, and they hoped that her desperate fight had left them with a clue that would finally bring her killer, and most likely Patricia and Jemima's, to justice. But the investigation was hindered for many reasons, some of them being understandable with the likes of DNA and other forensic technology still in its infancy, and some of them were inexcusable. Members of the public, press and law enforcement turned on the victims. They shamed them for going out dancing when they were menstruating and implied that they'd been loose and careless women, despite notes in Jemima's case saying that she'd kept a particularly clean home and her children were well looked after. And the investigators didn't take Jean's description of John seriously, despite the fact that she saw the sketch from Jemima's case down at the station and told the investigators that it looked incredibly similar to the man she'd left her sister with. Instead, the investigators claimed that Jean had been drinking, which she later denied, and said that Jean was an unreliable witness. They went back to Barrowland to interview the bouncers, where they put together another sketch based on the bouncer's description, even though the bouncers warned the investigators that they weren't good with names or faces, and the sketch greatly differed to Jean's. The investigators ran with the bouncer's sketch first and only switched back to relying on Jean's description later in the investigation, potentially losing them precious time and evidence in the process. Desperate and embarrassed, the investigators asked dentists to check their records, hairdressers to think of customers who fit the description, and thinking that the man they were looking for could possibly have been military, sent his sketch to British bases all over the world. But they got nothing back, and still have had nothing to this day. A former detective chief inspector, Les Brown, claimed that the police actually had Bible John, a name the killer was dubbed in the press for his constant quoting of the Bible, but they had let him get away. The man had been arrested after a quarrel with a young woman outside Barrowland in 1969, but he apparently did not have these overlapping front teeth. This was enough for the other detectives at the station to let him go, even though he closely resembled the sketches of Bible John, and Les Brown had been trying to prove that it was him ever since. The man in question had also been arrested outside Barrowland around the time of the murders and had even at one point needed to be taken in to get stitches in his head, but he'd given officers a false name and address and fled the scene as soon as backs were turned. The false name he'd given hospital staff and officers had been John White. Les Brown put his findings and his theories to the test when he published an autobiography in 2005 naming John White as Bible John, but instead of proving that John White was a killer in the eyes of the public, his work had the opposite effect. John White came forward and provided the police with DNA samples to clear his name. His sample was tested against the semen samples retrieved from one of the stockings, and they were not a match. John White was then cleared of any suspicion in the investigation. With the widespread attention the cases brought, many women came forward, also claiming to have been assaulted either in or shortly after leaving Barrowland, and one of them was Hannah Martin. Hannah believes that she knew Bible John, and the child that she gave birth to in 1970 was his. If that's true, her daughter could prove to be the DNA link that the investigators are still looking for, but so far this lead has also come back empty-handed. But some investigators believe that Bible John has already seen justice, not for his killings in Glasgow, but for a different one entirely. In 2006, Peter-Tobin beat, raped and stabbed a 23-year-old Polish student, Angelika Kluk, to death. There were definitely similarities between all four cases. This horrific crime happened in Glasgow and Peter was a local. Peter had even met his wife in Barrowland Ballroom in 1968, but after that he had moved to England before Jemima and Helen were murdered, and the investigation couldn't place him back in Scotland at the time of their killings. David Wilson, a criminologist who studied this theory for 3 years, believes that it is entirely possible that Peter was Bible John. All three of his ex-wives said that he would viciously abuse them and would be driven to particularly extreme violence whenever they were on their periods. Pictures from Peter in his 20s when he was still living in Glasgow also closely resembled the sketches of Bible John, and he was known to be a devout Roman Catholic. He was also known to use the alias John Semple. In David Wilson's own words, he said, quote-unquote, "I didn't set out to prove Tobin was Bible John, but I would stake my professional reputation on it." This led to an official investigation into Peter Tobin, but the key forensic evidence that could determine this case one way or another, the DNA evidence, had been lost. Samples taken from the scenes were incorrectly stored, driving the entire investigation into what would look like a permanent dead end. Despite this, the official stance of the investigation is that Peter Tobin wasn't Bible John, as they believe that they've found evidence of him being in England at the time of Jemima and Helen's murders. His teeth also didn't match the bite marks found on Helen's thigh. Peter never admitted to being a Bible John and was found dead in his prison cell in 2015. His death came at the hands of a fellow inmate who slashed Peter with a razor blade while he was sleeping, and Peter then bled to death, taking any of his secrets with him to the grave. There have been other theories, including that Bible John was a lab worker who travelled up to Glasgow to commit his crimes, or was potentially a military man or even a policeman. There is also the possibility that only Patricia's killing actually came at the hands of Bible John, and Jemima and Helen were the result of a copycat killer. But with their cases remaining unsolved for as long as they have, it's likely that we'll never know the true identity of the perpetrator. One of the few comforts we can take from this horrific series of tragedies is that the killings stopped after Helen Puttock, meaning that it's possible that the killer was either caught for some unrelated crime or met an untimely end himself.